Thanks for joining me on episode 345 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
Hey, I'm Matt Ham, author of Redefine Rich, and I challenge you to live richly by listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend, Scott Mader.
So how do you reduce this? How do you get rid of this feeling of greed? You give. You give often. You give more than you think you can. That's why putting tithing into the budget before you think you can, this is why giving before you think you can is important.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about investing in others through stewarding your treasures, I talk with you about how greed can hold you back from investing in others, how to recognize greed inside yourself, and what you can do to reduce greed.
As we talk about stewarding your treasures, wouldn't it be great if you could support this podcast and do it without costing yourself an extra dime? Turns out you can. All you have to do is use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon when you're ready to make a purchase via Amazon, and a small commission will come back to support the show. If you enjoy the show when you're ready to buy from Amazon, just use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon.
You've likely heard it in the movies when they talk about greed is good, or they talk about how there's rich people who are greedy, and you maybe even have thought this yourself, thought about someone who has more than you and thought about how they must have gotten that through being greedy and graspy. We talk about greed a lot in this culture. And the real truth is, a lot of times we always think of someone else as the greedy person. We don't reflect on the fact that sometimes we have greed in our heart as well. You know, there is a difference between building up wealth and providing for yourself and building a strong position from which you can help and serve others and being greedy. It's sometimes, though, difficult to tell the difference, especially if you're watching from outside. It's hard to see in someone else's heart. Are they being greedy? Are they hoarding? Or are they just providing for themselves and building up strength and being in a position where they can help others, and they're actually helping and caring for others all of the time? And sometimes even for ourselves, even when we are actually able to see inside our own heart, we still have this fear and this feeling that perhaps greed is taking root. Perhaps we're not just looking at building something, we're looking at getting more and more and more. You know, greed is an emotion that's based on being covetous, on wanting what others have without actually earning it. It's a destructive emotion. It's about stealing and robbing from others and taking for yourself more than one needs or deserves. And this doesn't have to be money either. We can be greedy about love. We can be greedy about relationships. We can be greedy about all sorts of things. The problem is that when you think about greed in those ways, when you think about that definition, then it's very easy, it's very tempting to see anyone who has more than you must be greedy. But the truth is they may not be. You know, there's an old joke about how much car is too much car for someone to buy without being greedy. You know, often we see someone who buys a brand new car and we think to themselves, oh my goodness, you spent so much money on that. That car is just, it's insane that you would buy that. And this could be true of a house. This could be true of all sorts of purchases. And the definition is, how much car is too much car to buy without looking like you're greedy to the people around you? And the answer is, any car that's more expensive than the one that they have. Because that's the truth. So often when we see someone else who has more than us, we immediately assume that they got it out of greed. The truth is, greed is really about insecurity. Greed is about putting your trust and your security in something else other than God. It's about forgetting that God is the ultimate provider and that all of our gifts and all of our benefits come from God. It's about not putting our security in the infinite, but rather putting our security in the finite. It's about looking for security in relationships, then you're greedy in relationships. If you want to put your security in money, then you're greedy about money because you're always afraid that you're never going to have enough. You're always afraid that the next moment it's going to take it away from you. And that fear, that insecurity is what drives you towards greed. It's about putting anything, money or anything else, and looking to put that in the place of God. It's about idolatry. If you do this, if you place your security in things that are finite, things like money, then you will never have enough. You'll never have enough to be able to freely and openly give to others, to give without expecting anything back, to recognize the needs of others and be able to serve and provide and invest in others. You'll never have enough. There are people that tell me all the time, as soon as I get financially secure, then I'll begin to give. Then I'll begin to tithe. And the truth is, what I tell them is, until you begin to give, until you begin to tithe, you'll never be financially secure because you have to start to recognize that emotion, that sense that you don't have enough, and recognize that that emotion indicates that you're insecure and you aren't secure in putting your faith in God first and that ability to provide for your needs. So how do you reduce this? How do you get rid of this feeling of greed? You give. You give often. You give more than you think you can. That's why putting tithing into the budget before you think you can, this is why giving before you think you can is important, because giving like that begins to change our heart. Giving like that is what allows us to break down that sense of greed. Give when it's hard and give when it's easy. Give and do it without an expectation of return. Do it with an open hand and an open heart. That's one reason that God calls for us to do this. God calls for us to tithe and to give sacrificially. Because doing that changes our hearts, changes our mind, and changes us from a sense of greed and entitlement and insecurity into a sense of security and faith and the ability to walk forward and to be content when you have it all and content when you have nothing, because your contentment comes from something infinite rather than something finite. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of treasures, you can sign up for our treasures tips by going to inspiredstewardship.com/treasures or text in the U.S. 44222 treasures tips. And we'll send you 5 weeks of our best tips on stewarding your treasures. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.